Nestled in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park is Steinhardt Aquarium, which is part of the California Academy of Sciences, and like the rest of the Academy, it's dedicated to conservation and education. Founded over 100 years ago, the aquarium is currently home to nearly 60,000 animals, and is one of the most biologically diverse aquariums on Earth. And from what I've seen online, it seems like an absolutely incredible place for any lover of the natural world. It's even home to Methuselah, an Australian lungfish who, at the age of 92, is the oldest captive fish in the world. But amazing though Methuselah may be, this episode isn't about her. Instead, it's about another one of the aquarium's popular attractions, their colony of African penguins. And more specifically, it's about the colony's former patriarch, Pierre. Pierre was born on the 16th of February 1983 at Maryland Zoo in Baltimore. In the June of that year, he moved 3,000 miles across the United States to Steinhardt Aquarium, which would be his home for the rest of his life. Pierre, along with 15 other penguins, was one of the founders of the colony and would swiftly take his place as a dominant male. Over the course of his life, he had 16 children, 27 grandchildren, and 11 great-grandchildren, and I'm sure more descendants have been born since his passing. For the most part, Pierre's life was relatively quiet, just the typical day-to-day of a well-cared-for captive penguin. In 1997, he developed a chronic cough, which was found to be caused by an allergy, but with twice-daily medication, his symptoms soon cleared up and he was back to normal. It wasn't until nearly a decade later that things would start to go wrong for him. Like all birds, penguins go through what's called a molt. They shed their old, damaged feathers and regrow new, fresh ones. For African penguins, this happens about once a year. Pierre molted as normal in June 2004, nothing unusual there. But then, when it came time for him to molt again, he didn't. He didn't even show signs that his body was preparing to molt, and he continued like this for years. The rest of the colony were all fine and molting as normal, but for whatever reason, Pierre just wasn't. And this became more and more of a problem over time, as his old feathers were continuing to get damaged and worn, to the point where they would start to fall out. But because Pierre wasn't molting, he wasn't growing in any new feathers. His coat became thinner and thinner until he began developing bald patches. His keepers didn't have a clue what was going on or what could be causing Pierre's arrested molt. They tried taking him off his allergy medication in case that could be the cause, but it made no difference and his cough became so bad that he had to go back onto it again. They also tried increasing his UV exposure, giving him extra heating and hormone treatments, but nothing seemed to work. The more time passed, the more feathers Pierre lost, and by 2008 it was clear that something had to be done. Even with extra heat lamps, Pierre had stopped swimming because, without feathers for warmth, the water left him chilled, and he became more reserved, dropping down the colony's hierarchy as the other penguins realised something was wrong with him and started bullying him. He was given a thorough health exam in February 2007, which included extensive blood tests to try and find the cause of his baldness, but the results didn't offer any further explanation for why he wasn't molting. In desperation, Pierre's keepers realised that even if they couldn't find the cause of his problems, they had to do something to help him to be able to be a penguin again, and that's when they decided to think outside the box and enlisted the help of a specialist dive shop called Oceanic Worldwide and a local seamstress named Celeste Argel. The plan was to create Pierre his own tiny wetsuit to cover his bald patches, which by now comprised quite a bit of his body, so that he could at least start swimming again. The problem was, though, that no one else had ever done anything like this before, so they were going to have to figure it all out for themselves. From the type of fabric, to the pattern pieces, to the closures and construction, it was very much a case of just learning as they went. Pierre went through multiple fittings as the team sorted out the details. They used neoprene, the same synthetic fabric human wetsuits are made from. It's flexible, waterproof, and provides excellent insulation. They used fabric that was 3mm thick so that it was blubbery enough to keep him warm and slightly buoyant in the water, but still flexible enough that it didn't interfere with his movement. They tried him in a few different colours, but found that black was the best because it was the one that got him the least attention from the other penguins. Whatever colour he wore, they were fascinated and would come up to investigate, but because black was the most like his actual colouring, they lost interest far quicker than when they used fabric that was white or brown. The edges of the fabric weren't hemmed so that they wouldn't potentially irritate his skin, and the holes for his wings were kept as small as possible so that he wouldn't get water inside the suit while swimming, which could also lead to skin irritation. One earlier incarnation of the wetsuit proved problematic when Pierre was scratching himself and managed to get one of his feet stuck through a wing hole. So not only did they make the hole smaller, they also took apart the entire costume and reassembled it to be a tighter fit. The original design also incorporated a small loop of fabric to help with removing the suit. It's a feature that's also present in human wetsuits for the same reason. Except Pierre managed to get his beak stuck through it whilst preening himself, and so that too had to be adapted, being replaced with a flat tab. The outfit closed in the back with strong velcro, which meant that it was secure, but it was still easy for keepers to put on and take off without causing him too much stress. Honestly, the level of thought that was put into this is incredible. Even the position of the seams was carefully thought out so as not to cause any kind of irritation. They also left his tail uncovered, because although that was now completely bare, it's also the first part of a penguin that new feathers grow in during a molt, and so it was important that the keepers could keep an eye on it to see if he finally did start molting. The attention to detail in Pierre's outfit really shows the level of care the staff had for him. Nothing was left to chance, and they weren't willing to risk him going through any level of discomfort, even if that meant more work for them. When they were finally done, Pierre was able to start showing off his cool new vest to the world, and it wasn't long before he was back to his old self, swimming and playing in the water and reclaiming his rightful place as lead male of the colony. In January 2009, a scientific paper written about the case was published in the aquarium journal Drum and Croker, which also featured a shot of him on the front cover, so I guess we can add fashion model to his CV. As well as detailing the process of making the vest and the benefit it had on Pierre, it also included a sewing pattern and in-depth instructions, so hopefully any future balding penguins will have an easier time getting fitted, although I can't say I've heard of a repeat of Pierre's case happening anywhere. Pierre also received some coverage in the mainstream media because, of course he did. He was a penguin in a tiny custom-made wetsuit. You'd have to have a heart of stone not to be charmed by that. And here's the crazy thing. The wetsuit worked. As well as enabling Pierre to start acting like a penguin again, in April 2008, after only 6 weeks of wearing his vest and almost 4 years after his problems began, Pierre finally molted. At long last, he finally shed what remained of his old damaged feathers and grew in a healthy new set across his whole body. And while I'm sure the wetsuit was kept on standby just in case he had any further issues, Pierre's molt cycle went back to normal after that, and he never had problems with it again. The exact cause of Pierre's arrested molt is still not really known, and it's also not known what exactly caused him to finally start molting again after so long. The time frame does suggest it was something to do with his wetsuit, but as we all know, correlation is not causation, and that can't be said for sure. One theory is based on the fact that Pierre was pretty slim for a penguin, lacking the thick layer of blubber that his kind tend to rely on, so it's possible that he was burning extra calories to keep warm, and just didn't have enough left over to get him through a molt until he had his vest made, which gave him the extra insulation he needed. Pierre was 25 when he had his vest made for him, which is very old by African penguin standards. In the wild, they typically live between 15 and 20 years. Like many species, they do live longer in captivity, but even so, Pierre was definitely getting on in years. Maybe it was the lack of fat combined with his age that caused the problems. Although if it was to do with his body temperature, then you would have thought that the extra heat lamps he was given prior to the vest would have done something, and they didn't. But I don't know, I'm obviously not an expert on penguin physiology, and that does seem to be the explanation that his keepers thought was the most likely, although they were open about the fact that it couldn't be confirmed. But the only thing that really matters here is the fact that Pierre went back to his usual, healthy, if slightly less fashionable self. He lived for another 8 years, before finally passing away at the ripe old age of 33 in May 2016. Vicky McCloskey, assistant curator at the time, told the LA Times that, quote, "He definitely had personality. He was the alpha penguin in the aquarium," end quote. And that he was, quote, "spunky right up to the very end," end quote. During his lifetime, Pierre was immortalised in a children's picture book about him, entitled Pierre the Penguin, A True Story. And of course, he'll always be remembered as the world's most fashionable penguin. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Animal Nerd Podcast. If you enjoyed it, then it would mean the world to me if you could support the show in any way that you can. Giving us a review or rating in your podcast player, subscribing to the show, telling your animal-loving friends, and if you're watching on YouTube, liking the video and leaving a comment are all really easy ways to do that really make a difference. Any money made through this podcast goes directly to the Little Rescue Zoo, an animal sanctuary that specialises in the care of exotic pets and animals with disabilities and chronic health or behavioural issues. So just by listening to and supporting the show, you're helping to make the world a better place for animals in need. So on their behalf, thank you. New episodes of the Animal Nerd Podcast come out every Tuesday, plus there's plenty more content on the Little Rescue Zoo's YouTube channel if you want more animal goodness in your life. So check us out there if you haven't already. A full list of sources used in this episode can be found in the show notes, alongside our social medias, email address, website, all of that good stuff. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay wild, friends!